Today's shipwreck video will be a break from the norm. Ordinarily, I focus on wrecks with a good amount of footage to look over. However, there are exceptions to this rule. Some wrecks are interesting, even though there's not much footage to look at, for better or worse. In this case, we'll be looking at the wreck of the battleship Mutsu. Very little of her remains on the bottom, and what little there is has not really been filmed much. There's some grainy YouTube footage, and similarly low-quality pictures floating about, but not much beyond that. Mutsu will, as such, be a video focused more on her salvage than on the wreck. There are, after all, quite a few interesting pictures from that salvage. As always, however, I'll begin with a short look at her sinking. This story is a bit of a complicated one. On June 8, 1943, Mutsu was anchored in Japanese waters. The ship was playing host to visiting aviation cadets and their instructors when, out of nowhere, a massive explosion broke her in two. This originated in her No. 3 magazine and sank the ship quickly with only 353 survivors. The origin of the explosion is where it gets complicated. The explanations for this range from submarine attack to issues with Type 3 anti-aircraft shells. What the Japanese Navy eventually landed on, however, was internal sabotage by a possibly suicidal sailor. This was based on witness testimony, though how accurate that is remains something of an open question. It is a habit of navies to blame issues like this on disgruntled sailors. Look to the turret explosion on USS Iowa for another example. An example that has become something of a classic case of Navy trying to cover its own fault by blaming someone who can't defend himself, even though that man was not responsible for the explosion. In Mutsu's case, we'll never know one way or another. The evidence is long gone, as are the survivors. More recently, there have been arguments made that it was an accidental fire or something of that nature. But again, we'll never know. So, with that out of the way, let's look at her wreck. As I said at the start, there isn't much left on the bottom. The vast majority of her wreck was pulled up in the 1970s, leaving only 114 feet, or 35 meters, of her bow from the bridge to the No. 1 turret. This section was, itself, heavily stripped of its outer plating, as you can see here on this sonar image. Because Mutsu is in shallow water, diving the wreck doesn't show much in the way of detail. What little I found is very, very silty and low visibility. The two pictures here come from a Japanese newspaper circa 2003. Even here, 20 years ago, you can see how rough the remaining wreck was. As she is in shallow water, Mutsu is falling apart about as fast as you'd expect. Sea life has thoroughly colonized the wreck, and the steel is rusting away. I imagine that has progressed even more in the intervening decades. How much more, I'm not sure, because I haven't been able to find anything more recent outside blurry YouTube footage. With that in mind, let's look instead to the salvage of the wreck. This is more interesting because the salvagers brought up some massive parts of the battleship in one piece, instead of simply cutting it into scrap underwater. Although, two things to clarify first. The turret from Mutsu that you can visit in Japan today is one of her original turrets. This was pulled off during her 1930s refit and eventually turned into a museum piece. The turrets that she went to war with, pulled up during the salvage, were scrapped. At least as far as I'm aware, anyway. And, secondly, Mutsu was very much a war grave. She took over 1,000 men down with her. If we were talking the 21st century, I doubt the Japanese government would have allowed this kind of operation. However, the 1970s were very much a different time. As for a comparison to modern illegal salvage, Mutsu was sunk in Japanese waters, and it was the Japanese who broke her up. Not quite the same thing. That out of the way, let's begin with those turrets. First we have turret 4. This was the sternmost turret, and has less pictures than the others. Here you can see it pulled up from the water upside down. I admittedly find it impressive The salvage operation could bring it up in one piece. Of course, since it was pulled up like this, there was quite a bit of water left inside the turret. You can see that pouring out through the gun barrels. There's probably a lot of contaminants in that water, as well as other unsavory things. Once it was high and dry, though, the turret was left in place, and as far as I've been able to find, broken up. While it was sitting on land, another picture was taken. This is a close-up shot of the turret face, barrels and all. It's impressive to look at, mostly because of how intact it is. While Turret 4 wasn't the epicenter of the explosion, it was still pretty close, and it was underwater for 30 years. Yet, some rust aside, the turret is in pretty good shape here. There's obviously some damage and such, but it's not like the turret is a mess of shattered steel. What is a mess of twisted steel in this next image seems to be Turret 4 being broken up. That said, the really striking images of a turret come from one of the other ones. In this one, you can see one being pulled from the water. Again, it's quite something to see a 16-inch gun turret just lifted out of the water like this. In one piece, barbette, guns, and all. This turret is a bit different as well, in that it has a rangefinder mounted on top. As impressive as this image is, though, there's a more impressive one. In this one, you can see the scale of one of these turrets far better. There's nothing quite like putting some random people next to the turret to drive home just how massive these things are. If you've ever had the good fortune to visit one of the fast battleship museums, you can get some idea of this. Although not quite the same idea as staring at one of these resting on its side out of the water. The other images of this turret aren't quite as distinctive due to a lack of people in frame. Don't get me wrong, there's still something to be said for, as an example, seeing the barbette like this, with all the piping and such still visible, along with the rusted metal. This is also an angle you don't normally see. The underside of a turret, which is normally buried deep in the ship, or underwater where few people can see it. That aside, for the remaining two pictures, we have angles from different directions. First, a look at it from behind. Here you can see the entire turret and barbette resting on its side. The rangefinder is clearly defined at the top, leading down into the curve of the turret itself. The difference in color is clearly visible, which I believe to be because of paint. The turret would have been painted to protect it from the elements, in a way the barbette wasn't. Regardless, the difference in color and rust patterns is very visible. The final image of this turret is a view from the front. Here, the way it was resting on the bottom can be seen. A dark part on the turret, in stark contrast to the rust red of the other parts. This is probably a result of the turret being buried on the bottom in the mud. This is also an angle that lets you see the guns themselves. One still pointing straight out, even on its side, and the other bent a bit out of shape. The website these pictures came from identifies this as Turret 3. If that's the case, I'm legitimately impressed how intact the thing is, considering this was the center of the explosion. However, that does round out the turrets. The rest of the pictures won't be quite as distinctive, although they are interesting in their own right. For instance, this one here. This is the extreme front of Mutsu's bow. Everything ahead of her first turret was pulled out of the water in more or less one piece. And in this picture you can see it inverted on the ground. The mounting point for her imperial crest is clearly visible. The chrysanthemum itself is, however, missing. That's unfortunate, but the bow itself is still pretty intact in this image. Upside down it may be, you can still see the line of the bow, where it comes to a point and where the point spreads out, as the hole widens from the extreme forward end. The second image of the bow is not as pretty. In this one you can see it from the side, which shows how big the piece they brought up was, even after they had already started scrapping it in place. You have the top of the bow resting on the ground, curving all the way up to the keel before moving back into twisted metal as the salvagers took Mutsu's wreck apart. What's really interesting about this shot, other than the whole her bow is out of the water thing, is where they broke up the shell plating. It gives a look inside Mutsu's hull that is almost unique to my knowledge. You don't really see a battleship like this unless it's in a scrapyard, and even then, they don't break it up quite like this. Moving on, this picture is another part of the bow, or so I'd assume anyway, because the bilge keel is visible on the bottom. If this was the same piece of hull, that would have been towards the top. In any case, this picture also provides a look inside Mutsu's hull, but a different one from the last picture. Instead of looking in from the side, this one looks in from the back. This isn't actually that unique of a shot. Ships can and have been scrapped like this. Generally speaking, though, that would be a merchant ship of some variety. Seeing a battleship like this, on the other hand, is far more unique and special. Unfortunately, the photo quality doesn't allow for making out much detail here. As for this next picture, I won't spend much time on it. What this amounts to is a closer view of Mutsu's interior as she was scrapped. However, that's about it. There's no distinguishing features or notable details. What makes this one worth including is simply the fact that you can see her internal frames in better detail. That just leaves two more pictures of the bow. This one right here is a view of the top of her bow. The deck is remarkably intact, all things considered, with the shape still recognizable. In fact, the overall condition of this piece is impressive. The form of the bow remains intact, and if you show this picture to someone without telling them what it is, they can probably guess what part of the ship this is from. Admittedly, it doesn't show much of the bow, however. So let's move to the last picture of this section of the ship. There's even less in the way of detail to see here. It's a very cropped picture of men working on the hull. Even with that in mind, there's a couple things to note here. First, the portholes. While the covering seems to be long gone, the portholes themselves are still in place. And they still look much the same as they would have when Mutsu was on the surface. Corrosion and damage aside, of course. The second thing to note about this image is the men working underneath who knows how many thousands of tons of compromised steel. I know this was the 1970s, but you could not pay me enough to be one of those men. With that terrifying image in mind, that wraps up the bow and leaves only Mutsu's stern section to cover. Most of her amidship section seems to have been broken up more before being brought up, so there's only 3 pictures left, all of which are her stern section, which was brought up in one piece like the bow. In this first image, that's pretty apparent. This seems to be after they began to break up the stern, but the overall shape is still there. Much like the bow, what's left of the ship is resting on its side in this shot. What makes it clear this is the stern section, though, is the presence of Mutsu's rudders. These are visible at the bottom of the wreck here, and stick out like a sore thumb. This is another case of, I'm impressed how intact this is. These could have very easily fallen off as the wreck was raised, but they remained in place. The second shot of the stern drives this point home. Even more of the wreck has been scrapped by the time this picture was taken, but as a side view, you can see more of the defining features. Not so much a rudder, but the propeller and shaft bracket. Helpfully marked on the picture so you know what you're looking at. That propeller, the bracket, and the shaft were preserved as the rest was scrapped. However, in the intervening years, I think the shaft has been lost. At least the propeller is still around, as seen here. Regardless, we now come to the last picture of Mutsu's salvage. The website lists this as hull bottom, which from the bilge keel towards the bottom of the image does seem to be the case. This shows more of her internal framing and decks, along with how relatively little rust there was at the time. It doesn't show much beyond that, however. As such, I'll wrap up this video with a set of pictures. These are pieces of Mutsu that you can still see, like the propeller I showed a little bit back. First, you have one of her main guns. Several of these 16-inch guns have survived at various museums across Japan. You can walk up to them and see how big they were, although without the ship or turrets, some of that scale is lost. Secondly, we have one of her 5.5-inch secondary guns, the best surviving example of one of these weapons, which is a good legacy for Mutsu to provide. It's important to look at things like this, to remember exactly what was being used to fight our past wars. And finally, the original number 4 turret. This was restored and open to the public as the only example of a Japanese battleship turret newer than Mikasa. It wasn't a turret that saw war. All of those are gone. Even so, this lonely turret is the best example of Japanese battleship engineering left outside of models. It shows the scale of Mutsu and is a stark reminder of how powerful these ships were in their day and age. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.